Well, thank you all for having me today, and a special thanks to John Samples for inviting me and for that kind introduction. One of the worst things about this election cycle, as he said, I had gotten to the point where I knew the districts pretty well, but now they've completely drawn the district lines. In California, they renumbered things, so I have 53 new representatives to memorize there and a whole bunch of districts to learn, which is kind of imposing. But I'm here to talk about The Lost Majority, my new book. My approach to these talks is kind of twofold. The first is I'm not going to talk a whole lot directly about 2012 in my speech. I figure a lot of that will come out in the questions because I think I have kind of a quirky outlook on 2008 and 2010. So if I talk about 2012 without giving the backstory, it won't make a lot of sense. So I will mostly focus on 2008 and 2010, but during Q&A, I consider it open game. If you want to know who the vice president's going to be, if you want to know what's going to happen in congressional districts, it'll just make more sense after the talk. And I found that talking about the book, it's best to kind of give some backstory on how the book developed, because I think that informs a lot of where the book is. The book starts out, I first kind of started thinking about this book in 2008 and 2009 and actually pitched it for the first time back then. As you may recall, after the 2008 elections, all the talk was about how we had entered into a new era of politics. Barack Obama had redrawn the map. Michael Lind went so far as to declare the wholesale rebirth of the American Republic and that we were entering the fourth American Republic with Barack Obama following in the footsteps of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and FDR. Harold Meyerson exhorted the president-elect to bring on the New Deal, but my all-time favorite has to be this Newsweek cover. To quote Rick Perry, oops. The story is that Barack Obama redrew the map and had a broad new coalition that would enable the Democrats to finally overcome the Republican realignment that had occurred in 1968 or 1980. But as I looked at the data, something jumped out at me, and it struck me that Barack Obama did not have a new map at all, and that there was no new coalition that had responded to his message of hope and change. In fact, Barack Obama's map looked a whole lot like Bill Clinton's map in 1996. And you can see in these maps, I've made it so that as a state goes more for Barack Obama, it becomes a little bluer. As it goes more heavily for Clinton, it becomes a little redder. And there are some differences, but it is at its essence, the same map in 2008 as it was in 1996. In fact, from 1996 to 2008, only 3 states moved more than 5 points towards the Democrats: Vermont, Nevada, and Hawaii. The biggest changes in the maps actually were losses for the Democrats. Arizona, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, Wyoming, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Louisiana, and Arkansas all moved 5 points or more away for the Democrats. In other words, Barack Obama did not build a new Democratic coalition in 2008. What he did was he took the coalition that Bill Clinton had built in 1996 and he narrowed it. And the most important way he narrowed it are those states in the middle of the country around the Ohio and Mississippi River, what I call Greater Appalachia. These states that were settled by Scots-Irish had remained loyal to the Democratic Party even after the rest of the South had moved away from the Democratic Party during the 60s and 70s, but finally during the 2000s began moving towards the Republicans and moved big time towards the Republicans in 2008. Counties that Bill Clinton had carried in Kentucky by as many as 45 points went Republican in 2008, some of them for the first time in history. Knott County, Kentucky went Republican for the first time since it had voted for Lewis Cass, who was a Whig, in 1848. Now, to be sure, Barack Obama won about the same percentage of the vote as Bill Clinton had won in 1996. So if he's losing people in Appalachia and in the Highlands South, something has to have moved towards him, and what he did was he took Bill Clinton's coalition of Bill Clinton had Appalachians and white working class voters, suburbanites, and then the traditional Democratic base among urban liberals and minorities. Barack Obama lost that Appalachian component, but he went deeper than Bill Clinton among suburbanites and among minorities. And so what you see is some of these states, like California, move a couple points towards the Democratic Party, but it does it in a lot of states. So you see a little bit more bluing on the West Coast. You see a little bit more bluing in Maryland with Baltimore and the D.C. suburbs. You see a little bit more bluing in Delaware and in Illinois. Now, you say, well, that's a fair trade-off, right? He loses one group, he goes deeper in other groups, it ends up being an 8-point win. The problem is that if you have a narrower coalition, you have less room for error. And the analogy I use is if there's three groups in your coalition, you were at 100%, and then you lose all your support among one group, you're at 66% still. If you only have two groups in your coalition, and you start out with 100%, you lose among one group, you're down to 50% of the overall vote. And this is especially important in congressional elections where, because of how congressional districts are set up in this country with a broad geographic diversity, if you do not have a broad coalition, you really risk a debacle. And to engage in a little bit of obvious foreshadowing, 3 Democratic senators hailed from these states in Greater Appalachia. Even after excluding minority-majority districts, 15 Democratic congressmen came from these states. Democrats controlled half the governorships, 11 of the 16 state houses. So if these states began abandoning the Democrats at the national level, it presents a huge problem for the party. Anyway, so the book was originally going to be called Big Red Rebound, Why the Republicans Will Be Back in Charge Sooner Than You Think. And it would have been really neat if that had sold because it would have been a great prediction. But perhaps unsurprisingly, New York book agents or book publishers just didn't want to hear it. They thought this was a broad new majority and that nothing was going to mess that up for the Democrats. So after the 2009 elections, where Bob McDonnell wins by the same margin that George Allen had won in 1993, so maybe Virginia hasn't swung that heavily towards the Democrats. New Jersey elects the most conservative Republican governor probably in its history. We revisited the books and they said, well, no, this is just a fluke. These are state elections. Barack Obama has a broad new majority, and nothing's going to mess that up. And so we had to wait for the 2010 elections to occur, and of course, it turned out to be a debacle for the Democrats. The problem at that point, the New York publishers were now interested, but you couldn't write a book saying why the Republicans will be back in charge sooner than you think, because it had already happened. So what I had to do, and I'm actually glad, in a way I'm glad, the book is a better book now because of what happened. It's not as sexy of a book, but what it caused me to do was go back and not just focus on the 2008, 2009, 2010 elections, but take a broader look at this whole idea that there can be these critical elections that completely redraw the map and usher in these permanent majorities. And what I found is that, for example, FDR's majority, he wins in 32, has a big win in 36, but he has a big loss in 1938 and the New Deal grinds to a halt. A large portion of it is actually repealed 1938 to 1945 during World War II, and no new major New Deal initiatives pass until 1964. FDR's coalition really came apart in 1938 and never truly reformed. The election of 1964 is really more of a foreshadowing of Bill Clinton's coalition than it was hearkening back to FDR's coalition. And so the analogy I like to use is this, coin flips. There have been 40 elections since the Republicans first ran a candidate in 1856 at the presidential level. And if you cast an evenly weighted coin, and I don't know why political scientists always feel the need to clarify that it's an evenly weighted coin, but they do. Cast an evenly weighted coin 40 times, you would expect to see 20 instances of either 2 heads or 2 tails in a row. And sure enough, if you take it back to 1856 and look at the presidential elections, there are 22 instances of either the Republicans or the Democrats winning 2 races in a row. If Barack Obama is reelected, it'll be 23. And you can go down the line. We'd expect to see 3 or 2 instances of 5 elections in a row. And indeed, we have 3 instances of 5 elections won by either party in a row. One run of 6, and we see one run of 6, the Republicans from 1860 to 1884. So my thesis is that this realignment stuff is a bunch of garbage. to be quite blunt, that elections are really responses to short-term inputs, and that coalitions can change very rapidly depending on the choices of the party. Now, I don't believe elections are purely determined by chance. It's just because parties tend to choose poorly frequently and can only cater to one or two portions of the coalition that puts them into power. Once they are in power and have to start picking and choosing on what they're going to do, their coalitions will tend to rapidly fall apart, and the other party will be positioned to take advantage, just as we saw with the Democrats in 2009 and 2010. There was no way that the Democrats were going to be able to implement an agenda that appealed to all portions of their coalitions, because the interests of minority groups, of urban liberals, of upper middle class suburbanites, of white working class voters are not always aligned. And so what you saw once the Democrats came into power was they had to choose what type of agenda they wanted. And so the first thing that they choose is the stimulus bill. Now, I'm not interested in the debate of whether the stimulus was the right thing or the wrong thing to do. The fact of the matter was, it was not something that moderate suburbanites were interested in because it was massive deficit spending, and moderate suburbanites don't like deficit spending. Now, the balanced budget of the Clinton years is what had brought these suburbanites into the Democratic coalition in the first place. It was the New Democrats, if you'll recall. Barack Obama did not govern like a New Democrat, and so he began to lose portions of his coalition. What happens after the stimulus? We have the cap and trade bill. Again, not something that moderate suburbanites are going to be particularly interested in, even less so the white working class voters who depend on a lot of these energy jobs. After that, the health care bill. Again, a massive spending bill that, although paid for, was not the gradualism that came to mark Bill Clinton's term after the 1994 debacle. And so we return to this idea. John Judas and Rui Teixeira had written a brilliant book in 2002 called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And the thesis of the book, remember this is shortly after Clinton leaves office, is that the Democrats had discovered this new philosophy. They called it progressive centrism that emerges in Bill Clinton's term. And they say that if you have this progressive centrism, you can keep this coalition together. And in theory, they're probably correct, but the problem is once the Democrats get into power, and the same thing is true of the Republican Party, but once either party gets into power, it's very difficult to keep a centrist agenda going. In the Democratic Party, this is especially true when your house is run by Nancy Pelosi and John Conyers and Henry Waxman and Barney Frank. The tendency of the parties is to move towards the interest groups that hold the commanding heights of their party, and it makes it very difficult to hold the center. And that's exactly what happens in Barack Obama's first term. Now, what about going forward? I do want to talk real quickly, and I know we're running up against the time limit, but I think one point is important to touch on, and that is we've heard a lot with the census figures about how the Latino population in particular is going to send the Republican Party into demographic extinction. I think there's three problems with this. The first is all these projections about what is going to occur assume that we have straight line projections. They say, if we see the same rate of Latino immigration that we saw over the last 20 years, the country will be majority-minority by 2030, and the electorate will be majority-minority by 2040. Republicans can't win with an almost all-white coalition. And this is true as far as it goes. But what you have to understand is we could take every man, woman, and child from Mexico, put them in the country today, and we would still be a 46% white country, and the electorate would be majority white. The straight line scenario just can't occur, and this is what we've seen with every immigrant wave in the course of this history, is that there's a huge surge for about 10 to 20 years, and then at a certain point you reach this kind of stasis where the people who want to immigrate have immigrated, and the people who want to stay behind, stay behind. And indeed, if you look at the immigration rates from Latin American countries, they flatline at the end of the decade. Now, you say that's because of the Great Recession, and perhaps it is, and perhaps it'll pick up again. Or perhaps it is like the giant wave of immigration we had from 1880 to 1920 that flatlines during the Great Depression and never comes back. Again, it's an alternate scenario we have to think of. The second scenario we have Second and third generation immigrants are rarely as heavily Democratic or Republican as their forebears. Cubans and Vietnamese, second, third generation, not as Republican as their parents. And we see the same thing with the Latino population. And indeed, if you look over time, the Latino population compared to the country as a whole has generally had a gradual trend towards Republicans. If you go back to the 1960s, the estimates are that Latinos were 80% Democratic group, and so you see that trend line continue. And finally, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction in politics. It's the same theme I have with these coalitions coming and going. John Chait had a piece where he talked about, this is we're reaching the end of the racialized Republican Party, and the Republican Party is going to have to change. And my response to that is, well, if you think that we're going to have a Democratic Party that is increasingly dominated by minority groups, you think our politics are going to become less racialized? That's an optimistic view of things, but I don't think that's right. And the test case is Arizona. Jan Brewer did everything you could possibly imagine a Republican governor do to alienate the Latino vote. And indeed, she ran about 13 points behind Latino voters vis-a-vis John McCain in 2008. But she actually ran ahead of McCain statewide. Why is that? Because she did a lot better than John McCain among white voters. And indeed, in 2010, Republicans were probably the first party to win over 60% of the white vote since 1822. We don't have exit polls going back that far, obviously, but looking at how the parties do nationally, we can estimate about what the white vote was doing. And I think that is a function of these increasingly racialized parties. So perhaps the emerging Democratic majority thesis is right, that the Republicans, that we'll continue to see Latino growth, that our parties won't become racialized and have the debates among them increasingly focused among racial issues, and perhaps there will be no assimilation among these new minority groups. But that would be contrary to the experience we've seen in the past, and I don't think that's really what's going to happen to the parties in the country. I think one of these other three scenarios is correct. Thank you.